What would you do if the only thing you had left in the world was a piece of paper a powerful man declared worthless? For Mary Whitcomb, that question wasn't a parlor game. It was the grit in her teeth and the dust on her boots in the summer of 1880. She had just lost her father's claim, the small square of Arizona land he had bled into for 20 years, all because a land agent with a silver watch chain and ink-stained fingers said her father's title was nothing more than a ghost story. But what that agent didn't know, what no one knew, was that the desert keeps its own records, and sometimes the truth isn't buried in a courthouse file, but is waiting in the most impossible of places, high on a canyon wall, locked in an iron chest, inside a boat that hadn't seen water in 100 years. Stay close, and let us share a story about how a dismissed woman and a forgotten relic rewrote the map of a valley. We'd love to hear where you're watching from, so drop a note in the comments below. Mary Whitcomb walked away from the cabin her father had built with his own hands, the scent of its pine walls and the memory of his quiet breathing still caught in her lungs. She did not look back. Looking back was a luxury for people who had something to return to. Behind her, Silas Croft and his men were already measuring for new fences, their voices loud and sharp in the still air, carving up the life she had known. Her inheritance, the sum total of her 27 years, was now loaded onto the back of a tired gray mule named Dust. A canvas sack with a change of clothes, a slab of bacon, a bag of cornmeal, her father's worn hammer, and the worthless deed, folded into a neat, painful square in her pocket. Croft's final words echoed in the heat. "The territory is moving forward, Miss Whitcomb. There's no room for sentiment or for faulty paperwork." He had tapped the deed with a dismissive finger, his smile never reaching his eyes. It was the smile of a wolf who had already eaten. She walked toward the sun, into the shimmering heat haze rising from the canyon lands, with no destination but a way. Her father's voice was a ghost at her ear, from a fever dream near the end. "Hold the line, Mary. This land remembers." But the land felt silent, vast, and indifferent. It had swallowed her father, and now it seemed ready to swallow her too. She followed a dry wash, its sandy bottom a pale scar through the red rock, simply because it offered a path where there was none. The walls of the canyon rose on either side, baked by a sun that offered no mercy. Hours passed. The world shrank to the rhythmic clop of the mule's hooves and the rasp of her own breathing. She was a small, moving speck of grief in an enormous, unfeeling landscape. The day bled from white-hot noon into the softer golds of late afternoon. Mary stopped to rest the mule in the shade of a towering rock spire, its shadow a deep, cool purple on the canyon floor. She shared a mouthful of water from her canteen with the animal, its soft lips brushing her calloused palm. It was in that moment of quiet, of shared thirst, that she looked up. Not at the sky, not at the canyon rim, but at the sheer rock face across the wash. And there it was. It was so wrong, so utterly out of place, that for a moment she thought the heat had finally broken her mind. Wedged high on a ledge, a good 200 feet above her, was a boat. A simple wooden rowboat, its paint scoured away by a century of sun and wind, its hull a ghostly silver gray against the red rock. It was canted at a sharp angle, held fast by a fall of rock, a piece of some long-forgotten flood, a testament to a time when water, not dust, had carved this place. It was a joke of nature, a bizarre monument to a dead river. She had heard prospectors tell tales of strange things found in the backcountry, but never this. It was a ship wrecked on a mountain of stone. Most people, she reckoned, would see it, shake their head at the strangeness of it, and move on. It was useless, a piece of high and dry driftwood. But Mary couldn't look away. Something about its stubborn, impossible perch resonated with her own. It was a thing that had been violently displaced, left stranded and forgotten, yet it endured. She squinted, shielding her eyes against the lowering sun. There was something else. Tucked beneath the rower's seat, lashed down with what looked like blackened, rotted rope, was the dark shape of a box. An iron chest, small but solid. It sat there, patient as stone, holding a secret for no one. A flicker of something that was not quite hope, but a cousin to it. A fierce, defiant curiosity ignited in her chest. That box, like her, had been dismissed by the world. It was too high, too old, too much trouble. But it was there. And suddenly, Mary Whitcomb had a destination after all. What does a person do when faced with an impossible prize? Do you write it off as a mirage, a trick of the light and a grieving mind? Or do you see it for what it is, the one thing left in the world that no one else has bothered to claim? What secrets do you think are waiting inside that iron chest? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of forgotten history and quiet courage. Now, Mary knew she couldn't reach it alone, and the first step toward claiming that impossible hope was to return to the very town that had cast her out. The next morning, Mary led Dust back toward the cluster of clapboard buildings that called itself Redemption. The town was little more than a dusty street, a general store, a saloon, and a livery, all simmering under the vast, empty sky. Entering the cool, dim interior of the store felt like stepping into another world, one of smells, leather and coffee, tobacco and flour. She needed salt, more cornmeal, and rope. Lots of rope. The storekeeper, a man named Henderson with a perpetually worried expression, measured out her goods. "Heard you were moving on, Mary," he said, not unkindly. "Croft, he's a hard man." "He is," she replied, her voice flat. As Henderson was wrapping her purchases, the door creaked open and Silas Croft himself strode in, bringing the heat and glare of the street with him. He saw her, and a slow, superior smile spread across his face. He nodded to Henderson, but spoke to her. "Still here, Miss Whitcomb? I thought you'd be halfway to the territorial capital by now, looking for some charity." Mary refused to meet his gaze, focusing instead on her supplies. She kept her silence, a habit learned from a father who believed a person's character was shown in the insults they ignored. She paid Henderson, her coins making a small, final sound on the wooden counter. As she gathered her sack, she asked, more to herself than to anyone, "Ever hear of a boat stuck up in Red Wash Canyon?" Croft let out a short, barking laugh. "A boat? Good Lord, the sun's got to you already. Chasing ghosts in the dry lands, are we? Some people just can't accept when they've lost everything. They start seeing treasure in the clouds." He turned to the other men in the store, winking. "Leave her be. She's touched by grief." The men shuffled their feet, a few offering weak, complicit smiles. Mary's shoulders tightened, but she walked out, her back straight. As the screen door slapped shut behind her, a voice, quiet as rustling leaves, stopped her on the porch. An old Yavapai woman sat on a stool, her fingers deftly weaving yucca fibers into a basket. She was ancient, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her eyes dark and deep. She had been there as long as Mary could remember, a silent fixture of the town. She looked up at Mary, her weaving hands never pausing. "The river puts things where they belong," the old woman said, her voice dry as the desert floor. You just have to be strong enough to get them down. It wasn't advice. It was a pronouncement, a cryptic weight that settled on Mary's shoulders, not as a burden, but as a confirmation. She nodded once to the woman, a flicker of understanding passing between them, and led her mule away from the town's mockery and toward the canyon's promise. The journey back to the canyon was different. Before she had been fleeing, now she was advancing. The landscape no longer felt indifferent. It felt watchful, a silent witness to her purpose. She made camp in the same spot, at the foot of the cliff, the silhouette of the boat a dark promise against the deepening twilight sky. For 2 days, she did nothing but observe. She used her father's old brass spyglass, an instrument he'd used to watch for stray cattle or the distant dust cloud of a coming storm. She watched the boat as the sun journeyed across the sky, charting the way the light and shadows moved across its weathered hull. It was an act of patience her father had taught her. Never rush a wild thing, he'd say, whether it's a horse or a piece of land. You watch it. You learn its habits. The boat was a wild thing, captured and tamed by the rock. Through the spyglass, she could see the details that distance had blurred. The wood was bleached and splintered, the ribs of the hull exposed in places like the bones of some great animal. The iron chest was black and pitted with rust, its presence a dark, dense question. She saw the frayed ends of the rope that held it, wondering how they had not disintegrated after so many years. She spent the hours committing the cliff face to memory, mapping every crack, every ledge, every stubborn bit of scrub brush that clung to the stone. It was a vertical puzzle, and she was searching for the first piece. She ate her simple meals of corn cakes and bacon, the smoke of her small fire rising straight up in the still air. Dust, her mule, stood nearby, his ears occasionally flicking toward the sounds of the canyon, the cry of a hawk, the skitter of a lizard on rock. He was her only companion, a steady, breathing presence in the immense silence. At night, she lay wrapped in her blanket, staring up at the boat. The stars were brilliant, cold, and impossibly far away. The boat seemed to float among them, a ship sailing on a sea of night. A feeling of profound loneliness washed over her, so sharp it was almost a physical pain. She was one woman against a mountain of stone, chasing a mad hope. The mockery of Silas Croft echoed in her ears, touched by grief. Maybe he was right, but then she remembered the calm, certain eyes of the old Yavapai woman, strong enough to get them down. The words were a quiet anchor in the lonely darkness. She would not be broken by the scale of the task. She would simply begin. On the third morning, as the first pale light of dawn touched the canyon rim, a glint caught her eye. It was sharp and brief, a flash of gold in a world of red and gray. It came from the boat. She raised the spyglass, her hands steady, and scanned the stern. At first, she saw nothing but weathered wood. She waited, holding her breath, as the angle of the sun shifted. There it was again. A small, rectangular plate, no bigger than her hand, was affixed to the transom. It was made of brass, tarnished nearly black by the years, but one corner had been polished clean, perhaps by the ceaseless wind rubbing it against a jut of rock. That was the source of the flash. She focused the spyglass, her knuckles white. The glass was old, the lens imperfect, but she could make out faint, formal engravings, letters and numbers. She couldn't read the words, not from this distance, but she could clearly see an insignia etched in the center. An eagle with its wings spread, clutching arrows and an olive branch. It was a federal seal. Her heart began to beat a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. This wasn't some prospector's lost skiff or a rancher's pleasure boat washed away in a flood. A government seal meant it was an official vessel. But what would a government boat be doing here, in a place that hadn't seen a real river in living memory? The Colorado was 100 miles to the west. The Gila was a hard ride south. No expedition would have come this way. It made no sense. This was the first clue, the first detail that refused to fit the story of a simple, random wreck. The boat wasn't just old, it had a history, an official one. The chest wasn't just a strongbox, it was cargo. A cold certainty began to form in her mind. Whatever was in that chest wasn't just valuable, it was important. The weight of the task before her suddenly grew, but so did her resolve. She lowered the spyglass, the brass cool against her cheek. The sun was climbing higher, the canyon warming around her. The boat no longer looked like a ghost. It looked like evidence. But she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she could not get it down alone. She needed help. She needed someone who knew ropes and rock, someone who understood the brutal physics of weight and gravity. And in the rough settlements and lonely camps of the territory, there was only one name that came to mind. A man they said was as scarred and stubborn as the mountains he haunted. A man they called Pike. Finding Benjamin Pike was a journey in itself. He lived apart, in a small cabin tucked into a high, hidden valley, a place you couldn't find unless you were already lost or knew exactly where to look. Mary followed the vague directions she'd gleaned from a sympathetic blacksmith. Follow the crow, not the trail. It took her a full day of hard riding, pushing dust up steep, unstable slopes. She found the cabin at dusk, a plume of smoke rising from its stone chimney, the only sign of life. It was a simple, solid structure, built to withstand the elements, not to welcome visitors. A lean, three-legged dog rose from the porch as she approached, letting out a low growl, but not moving to attack. Then the door opened. Benjamin Pike was a man made of angles and silence. His face was a roadmap of a hard life, dominated by a long, puckered scar that ran from his left temple down across his cheek, pulling one corner of his mouth into a permanent, grim line. His eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, and they took in everything. Her, the tired mule, the determined set of her jaw, without a flicker of surprise. He did not speak. "Mr. Pike?" Mary said, her voice sounding thin in the mountain air. He just nodded. She told her story. She didn't embellish or plead. She laid out the facts as plainly as she could. The lost claim, Silas Croft, the boat on the canyon wall, the iron chest, the federal seal. She spoke of her need for a man who knew ropes, a man who wasn't afraid of a hard climb. When she was finished, the silence stretched, broken only by the whisper of the wind in the pines. He looked at her hands, still holding the mule's lead rope. They were not the hands of a soft woman. They were calloused and capable. He looked at her eyes and saw not desperation, but a fierce, unyielding resolve that matched his own. "A share," he said finally, his voice a low rasp, unused to conversation. "Of what's in the chest?" "A fair share," Mary countered. "We split it." He gave another short, sharp nod. "Get down, water your animal." And that was it. The partnership was forged. The next day, they returned to the canyon. Pike's own mule laden with coils of heavy rope, iron pitons, pulleys, and a sledgehammer. The labor began. It was a slow, dangerous ballet on the face of the cliff. Pike moved with an economy and grace that belied his scarred appearance. He was a river pilot once, he told her in a rare moment of talk, before a boiler explosion on the Colorado had scarred him and soured him on the company of men. He knew knots and rigging better than he knew people. He would climb, driving the pitons into the rock with sure rhythmic strikes of his hammer, the sound echoing through the canyon. Mary stayed below, his anchor feeding out the rope, her eyes fixed on his small form high above. They worked from dawn until dusk, speaking little, a silent understanding passing between them. It was a language of shared effort, of trust placed in a knot, of a life held by a rope. Her mule and his three-legged dog, who he called Tripod, waited patiently at the base of the cliff, a small, quiet audience to the immense task unfolding above them. Days passed. The rope system grew more complex, a web of hemp and iron clinging to the stone. Finally, they were ready. Pike secured the last line around the boat itself, and slowly, carefully, they began to lower their impossible prize to the canyon floor. The boat descended in a slow, groaning shudder of ancient wood. It scraped against the rock face, sending down showers of dust and pebbles, a sound like a long, held breath being released. When it finally touched the sandy bottom of the wash, it landed with a solid, final thud that echoed in the quiet canyon. It was here. After all the watching, the planning, the brutal labor, it was finally within reach. The boat was surprisingly intact, a testament to the dry air that had preserved it. But their attention was fixed on the iron chest. The chains holding it were rusted but strong. Pike shattered them with a single, well-aimed blow from the sledgehammer. Now the chest sat free on the sand, black and silent. The lock was a solid mass of rust, the keyhole sealed shut. There would be no finesse. Pike swung the sledge again, the blow ringing out like a judgment bell. A second swing and a third. The iron protested, then bent, then broke. With a final heave, he pried the lid open. A musty smell, of old paper and dry leather and trapped time, rose from within. Mary knelt beside it. There were no gold bars, no silver coins. Her heart, which had been pounding with a frantic, greedy hope, settled into something deeper, more serious. The chest was filled with oil-skin-wrapped parcels, tied with brittle twine. Her fingers, trembling slightly, worked at the knot on the topmost package. She pulled back the stiff, cracked material. Inside was a book, a surveyor's log, its leather cover dry and flaking. The pages were filled with a neat, precise script, detailing coordinates, landmarks, and measurements. She opened another parcel. It held a series of rolled maps, drawn with an expert hand on heavy linen paper. They were topographical charts of the entire region, from the river to the high peaks. Then she saw the brass plate again, the one she'd spotted from below. It had been knocked loose in the fall, and it lay inside the chest. She picked it up. U.S. Territorial Survey, Colorado River Expedition, 1858. Beneath it, the name of the chief surveyor, Elias Whitcomb, her grandfather, a man her father had spoken of only in hushed, sad tones. He'd been part of an early mapping expedition, lost in a flash flood with his boat and all his records. The territory, still new and unorganized, had written him off as dead, and his work as gone forever. These weren't just any records. They were the original federal surveys, the foundational documents that established every boundary, every claim, every property line in the valley, filed and registered decades before Arizona was even a proper territory. She unrolled the largest map, her eyes scanning for the familiar shape of her father's land. There it was, clearly marked, with her grandfather's signature and the date of the survey. And next to it, dozens of other small claims, belonging to the other families who had been pushed out by Silas Croft's legal maneuvering. Croft's own vast holdings were shown for what they were, a patchwork of fraudulent claims based on newer, falsified maps he had filed with a corrupt territorial clerk. This chest didn't hold a fortune. It held the truth. A truth that had been sitting in the sun for 22 years, waiting for someone strong enough to get it down. A shadow fell over the map. Mary looked up. Benjamin Pike was standing over her, his expression unreadable, but his pale eyes were fixed on the documents. He had seen it too, the scope of the lie they had just uncovered. Before either of them could speak, a rumble, low and distant, vibrated through the soles of their boots. It wasn't thunder. The sky above was a brilliant, cloudless blue. Pike's head came up, his gaze sweeping the canyon rim. He sniffed the air. "Rain," he said, his voice flat with certainty. "Up high, in the mountains. A summer storm, a gully washer miles away but feeding the same watershed they were standing in." He knew what it meant. A flash flood. The dry wash could become a raging river in minutes. "We have to go," he said, already moving, coiling ropes with an urgent efficiency. At that exact moment, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the mouth of the canyon. 3 riders silhouetted against the bright sky. Silas Croft, flanked by 2 hard-faced men Mary recognized as his hired muscle. He had followed them. He must have seen their camp, seen them working the ropes. He reined in his horse, his eyes immediately locking on the open chest. A triumphant, ugly smile spread across his face. "Well, well, Miss Whitcomb. Looks like you found your ghost. I'll take that off your hands. Finder's fees have been paid." His men dismounted, their hands resting on the pistols at their hips. "Those are federal records," Mary said, her voice shaking but firm as she stood to face him. "They prove my father's claim. They prove you're a thief." Croft laughed. "They're scrap paper until they're filed with a judge, and they won't be. Give me the chest." The distant rumble grew louder. A sudden, cool wind swept down the canyon, carrying the scent of wet earth. "You fool," Pike growled at Croft. "The river's coming back for its own." But Croft's greed made him deaf to the warning. As his men moved forward, another sound cut through the tension, a panicked shout. A wagon, a family of settlers by the look of it, had tried to take the wash as a shortcut. They were halfway down the canyon, and the first wave of water, a muddy brown tongue, was already licking at their wheels. The father whipped his horses, but they were panicking, the wagon stuck. Mary and Pike exchanged a single, stark look. The papers, or the people. It wasn't a choice. As Croft's men lunged for the chest, Pike threw Mary a coil of rope. "The family!" he yelled, and charged not at Croft, but toward the stranded wagon. Mary scrambled to secure the most important document, the main ledger book, tucking it deep inside her shirt, the leather cover scraping against her skin. She then ran to help Pike, leaving the chest and the rest of the maps behind. In the chaos of the rising water, the terrified horses and the shouting family, Silas Croft saw his chance. He grabbed the heavy iron chest, heaved it up in front of his saddle, and spurred his horse back the way he came, a victorious sneer on his face. He would be clear of the flood long before it reached its peak. He had won. He had the evidence, or so he believed. The water came faster now, a churning, muddy torrent that filled the wash from wall to wall. It tore at the wheels of the settler's wagon, threatening to sweep the entire thing away. The father, a gaunt man with desperation in his eyes, was trying to unhitch the horses while his wife clung to two small children in the back. Pike and Mary worked with the silent, focused energy of people who understood disaster. Pike, the old riverman, read the currents, shouting instructions. "The boat! Use the boat!" The old survey boat, their impossible prize, was now their only hope. It was heavy, but the rising water made it buoyant. Together they managed to push and pull it alongside the wagon. Mary helped the mother and her terrified children into the relative safety of the rowboat, while Pike and the father cut the frantic horses free. They used the last of their ropes to create a lifeline to a rocky outcrop on higher ground. One by one, they ferried the family across the churning water. Mary's arms ached, her muscles screaming in protest, but she pulled on the rope, her knuckles raw. The image of the children's wide, fearful eyes burned into her mind. The main ledger was a hard, reassuring square against her ribs. They made it. Soaked, shivering, and exhausted, they huddled on the high ground as the flash flood roared past, a brown monster devouring the canyon floor. It swept away the wagon, the remains of their camp, everything. They watched as it tore the heavy iron chest from Silas Croft's grasp a half-mile downstream, his horse screaming as it was pulled under. The chest disappeared into the maelstrom. Croft himself barely managed to cling to a rock, defeated and alone. The family they had rescued looked at Mary and Pike with a dawning, profound gratitude. The father, whose name was Thomas, grasped Mary's hand. "You saved us," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved my family." As the floodwaters began to recede, leaving behind a thick coat of mud and debris, Mary pulled the ledger from her shirt. It was damp, but the oilskin wrapping she had hastily replaced had protected it. She held the truth of the valley in her hands. She hadn't just saved a family, she had saved a community. And as she looked from the grateful faces of the settlers to the quiet, steady presence of Benjamin Pike beside her, she realized she no longer felt alone. They had faced the flood, and they had held the line. Their return to redemption was a quiet spectacle. Mary and Pike walked into town, leading their mules, followed by Thomas and his family. They were all covered in mud, their clothes torn, their faces etched with exhaustion. But they walked with a purpose that made people stop and stare. The story spread before they even reached the center of town, carried by Thomas, who told anyone who would listen how they had been saved, how Mary and Pike had risked everything for his family, while Silas Croft had fled with a stolen chest, only to be defeated by the very land he sought to control. The townspeople, who had once whispered and smirked at Mary's fool's errand, now looked at her with a new expression: respect. She walked straight to the marshal's office. As fate would have it, a traveling territorial judge was there, settling a dispute over water rights. He was a stern, impartial man with eyes that missed nothing. Mary placed the muddy, water-stained ledger on his desk. "Judge," she said, her voice clear and strong, "this is the original U.S. survey ledger for this valley, from the Whitcomb expedition of 1858. The judge opened the book with careful hands. He was a man who understood the sanctity of such documents. He read the opening page, his eyebrows rising. He spent the next hour comparing the ledger's meticulous entries with the official plat map hanging on the wall, the one filed by Silas Croft. The silence in the room was absolute. The judge traced the lines on the map with his finger, then looked back at the book. The fraud was not just present, it was blatant, arrogant. Just then, Silas Croft stumbled into the office, his fine suit ruined, his face pale with shock. He saw the ledger on the desk, saw the look on the judge's face, and all the fight went out of him. He didn't say a word. The judge looked up, his gaze moving from Croft's defeated face to Mary's steady one. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, his voice carrying the weight of law, "it appears your father's paperwork was not faulty. It was, in fact, the only valid title in this entire matter." He closed the ledger with a definitive sound. "I am voiding all claims based on the Croft plat map, effective immediately." A quiet murmur went through the crowd that had gathered outside the door. It was the sound of a community righting itself. Croft wasn't arrested or run out of town on a rail. He was simply undone. His power, built on a foundation of lies, had been washed away. He turned and walked out, a man hollowed out by his own greed, the townspeople parting before him not in fear, but in dismissal. Mary had her father's land back, and so did a dozen other families. The last light of day settled over the valley, turning the dust in the air to gold. Mary stood on the porch of her father's cabin, a place she thought she would never see again. The air smelled of clean, rain-washed earth. Benjamin Pike stood beside her, not too close, but near enough that she could feel the quiet strength of his presence. He had helped her repair the fence Croft's men had started to tear down. Thomas and his family, who had nowhere else to go, were staying in the barn for now, their quiet gratitude a warm presence on the homestead. The old survey boat, scarred but whole, had been hauled up from the canyon. It rested near the barn, not as a wreck, but as a monument. A strange, beautiful testament to a long-dead river and a long-buried truth. Pike looked out at the land, at the neat lines of the fences that now marked the true and proper claims of the valley's settlers. His gaze was distant, as if seeing the twists and turns of a river only he could navigate. He broke the comfortable silence. "Your father told you to hold the line," he said, his voice a low rumble. It wasn't a question. He was echoing the words she'd told him during their long days on the cliff face. Mary looked from the valley, now secure and at peace, to the impossible boat, and then to the scarred, solitary man who had become her partner. She thought of the chest, the flood, the family, the ledger. She thought of how a place of violent displacement had become a source of justice, how a tool of survival had become a vessel of rescue. She had come back not just to reclaim a piece of property, but to restore a community. "We built a harbor," she replied softly. It was the truest thing she had ever said. They stood together as the first stars appeared, two people used to being alone, discovering the quiet, sturdy architecture of a home worth defending. Thank you for joining us for this story of resilience and redemption. We believe that true strength is often found in the quiet refusal to be dismissed, a theme we hope resonated with you today. If you enjoyed Mary's journey, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more tales of the unsung heroes of the past. Let us know in the comments what part of the story moved you the most. We have another story coming soon, about a lone doctor and a forgotten promise that changed the fate of a town on the brink of winter. Until then, be well.